geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, and my guest, Tom. Now, Tom was on previously with me to talk about a video that Candace Owens did, where she made some pretty egregious claims concerning Ukraine, Russia, and Tucker Carlson, and we did a debunk, not of the entire video, but of a little excerpt of the video. And we're going to do that again today with a short video of Russell Brand. Now, Russell Brand's a bit like Marmite in the UK, which is something that's famously, you either love him or you hate him. You either love it or you hate it. So with him, he's got some really strong followers, a bit like Elon Musk, and a lot of people who really dislike him. And people like me, I used to love Russell Brand, actually. And there are certain topics that he talks on that I'm like, yeah, I'm really with you on that. And however, recently he seems to have veered off to a bit more of a populist positioning, whereby he's making some claims that are far more controversial on a number of topics that I wonder whether he would have made maybe 10 years ago. And so there's been a really interesting evolution of his beliefs, I think. But anyway, before we delve in, thanks, Tom, for coming along and for choosing this video for us to look at. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself for people who won't know you, and also why you decided to choose this video?
Cheers. Yeah, thanks. So I mean, with this, so I'm Tom. Yeah, we've spoken before. I mean, like you also, I've sort of been a fan of sort of Russell Brand, and I think, you know, he's sort of a comedian. I think his heart is often in the right place, but I feel like at the moment maybe sort of his opinions have swerved off a little bit in a direction that I don't agree with. And yeah, I saw this video. I mean, unsurprisingly, I sort of look at a lot of sort of Ukraine news and videos. Obviously, I follow your channel, but this one popped up in my sort of YouTube feed, and I watched it, and I thought, you know, this is another good one for us to pick apart.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's quite content rich. I mean, like as we'll go through it, but I mean, it's rapid fire of almost like one Russian propaganda, you know, talking point after the next. So, you know, none of it's really sort of substantiated, but it's just firing all of this stuff out. So I just thought, you know, he's got a big following, and this sort of stuff gets picked up on by a lot of people. So I thought, yeah.
Rather like, in fact, your kind of Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, Russell Brand has that big following, but also has a scattergun approach, which just by the nature of him being a very quick speaker and going da 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 da. So that you've got to be careful about letting things slide. And we could pick on each individual point as you go through. We're going to leave it a little bit and then deal with them in sort of clusters, I guess. But just to let you know, Tom's got a bit of a philosophical background. Also, is it a legal background as well? Educationally. So, you know, hopefully has a good sharp mind for the sort of stuff that we're going to be talking about. Right, let's just get straight into it then and listen to Russell Brand and Bill Maher. So Bill Maher, again, an interesting person who has people that love him, people that hate him, politically quite aligned to Russell Brand. So Russell Brand is traditionally more to the left, but has got elements of his thinking recently that have been populist right, and therefore he's kind of divided some of his previous fans, but also that can be said about Bill Maher, who's been a bit all over the place recently. I seem to be coming back to where he was a couple of years ago, but he's been flirting with all sorts of different views. Anyway, let's get into. Well, sorry, anything you disagree or agree with there?
No, I just completely agree with you. I mean, you're seeing this, that he's a bit skeptical, a little bit of some of the stuff that Russell says. He's a bit of a counterpoint. He does push back against some of the stuff that Russell says, but he also sort of, takes on, especially on the NATO point, we'll see, but he sort of agrees with the sort of, a Russian sort of view on that, which we'll deal with, but we'll come to, but you see there.
Well, the Panama Papers suggested that Zelensky, like a lot of Ukrainian politicians, has some interesting business dealings, and that he rejected the Minsk agreement. And there was a peace deal on the table, and the West lobbied Zelensky not to take that peace deal. So said the former Israeli prime minister.
Because his country got invaded illegally. I mean, I don't know why you're.
Well, I would say, Bill, because of ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's been encroachment on former Soviet territory. That there was a NATO-inspired coup in 2014, and that there are significant profits being made. It's the same in a sense. Look, I would offer this.
I don't know that I can let that go on any further, actually, mate, because I am already chomping at the bit. This is pretty egregious pro-Russian thinking that I think comes from a history of being anti-American imperialism. And I do get that because I have been there previously, but I think well, I'll get your view in a minute before I continue, but I think that's where he's coming from. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, later on in this, well, I'm not sure if we'll even play that far, but he does start talking about sort of 9/11 and the consequences of that and the fallout from that, and obviously essentially referring to the Iraq War and a lot of expenditure there. And so I think in his mind, like he's got his view of what happened after the Iraq War and the response after 9/11 and the Iraq War. And it all just blurs the line. So for him, when he sees something happening in Ukraine and American military being involved, it's just that template is being copied across in his mind.
Exactly. And just to let the viewers know that I've never seen this video, right? So I'm reacting live to this. Tom has seen this video and is the one coming with some receipts and a little bit more prepared. But this idea of NATO encroachment, and we'll talk about Minsk in a second, but NATO encroachment is a really one-sided view of what's happened historically in Eastern Europe. So the first thing to note is when these kind of Warsaw Pact, when these countries in Eastern Europe, formerly the Soviet Union, came out of the Soviet Union, where did they go to themselves first? Like they went to NATO. NATO didn't encroach on them. They actually went to NATO. So that's a really important point to make. And also, when you're talking about NATO encroachment, which is a very loaded term, you're talking about NATO getting involved in countries. And the question is, why are NATO getting involved in those countries? And is Russia being involved in those countries to prompt NATO's kind of retaliation, if you like, or some kind of repudiation of the Soviet or the Russian involvement? And that's exactly the case with Ukraine, and I'll get onto that in more detail. But any initial thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's this sort of stupid idea of just saying, oh, the way they talk about it is as if NATO has gone to these countries and conquered them. It's sort of taken over the government and it's really imposed itself on them. That's the absolute lie. Basically, what happened was as soon as these sort of countries were free of Russia, I mean, they've just been begging to join NATO because they are scared of Russia. And, the idea that NATO is forcing itself, I mean, Ukraine is begging to join NATO and the West is saying no. It's countries are asking to join NATO, not NATO imposing itself on countries. And then you've got to ask the question, why do they want to join NATO? It's because of Russian behavior. If Russia wasn't so aggressive, these countries wouldn't be asking to join NATO. And look, my view is we should have, essentially expanded NATO. Well, we should have allowed Ukraine to join. I mean, if you look at Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, if they weren't part of NATO now, what would their situation be? It would be incredibly dangerous. I mean, who knows? They could have already been invaded. I mean, they've done it with Ukraine because it's not in NATO. Thank God they are part of NATO. It's ridiculous to say, oh, we shouldn't have let these countries join NATO. Thank God they're part of it. That's giving them some measure of safety. The tragedy, the biggest tragedy of this whole Ukraine situation is the fact that it's not in NATO. That's the only thing that could have protected it. So this idea that, oh, we shouldn't allow countries to join this defensive alliance is complete nonsense.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Dan, and that's such a powerful point. That indeed, like, rather than blaming NATO for being too I guess encroaching, it's like we could blame NATO for not doing that enough, because the protection it would have offered to Ukraine would have stopped hundreds of thousands of people dying. Exactly. And yeah, it's such an important point. But I really hate it when people take a look at something that's involved all of these kind of international interactions where you've got particularly the Russians getting involved insidiously, nefariously, and in clandestine and often not so clandestine ways in the political machinations of what is aspiring to be a democratically functioning government and country. When you look at the interaction of the West, let's call it, and Russia, and then see all that enmeshed activity, and then say that's NATO's fault, like to just cherry pick part of the interaction out there and say, well, this whole thing is NATO's fault, and it's to say, well, what about Russia? Like, do Russia play no part in that? Like, do you know how Russia have got involved in trying to steer the democratic outcome or the less than democratic outcome of Ukraine? No.
Yeah.
So why is this all the West's fault? It's really cherry picking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just in that, so I think we got through like 40 seconds there, but
Yeah,
Russell already made the points that Zelensky said, like, a lot of Ukrainian politicians has some like interesting business dealings. So he's again talking about corruption in Ukraine. I mean, that's a point we could talk about. There's the Minsk agreement. He's talking about sort of the peace deal, and it's just all of this stuff. I don't know if you want to get into any of these points yet, but like it's all unjustified nonsense.
well, let's talk about talk about the Minsk agreement. What are your thoughts on that, and whether the West or NATO or Ukraine can be blamed for the Minsk agreement or the non-adherence to the Minsk agreements or whatnot?
Yeah. So he mentions specifically about Zelensky there and the Minsk agreement. Now there was I was like looking into this to say, okay, what it specifically, because obviously there's about the Minsk agreements and how they sort of came in to existence, and there were various different versions, and there's a lot we can say about that. But just one point I just want to pick up on is just the Zelensky comment, because I think what he's referring to there is, again, this is a bit of a Russian conspiracy. We're saying a Russian conspiracy. It's a Russian sort of propaganda spin on a comment. So Zelensky had, I think, an interview with Der Spiegel, sort of the German newspaper, and then in which he sort of said something along the lines of the Minsk agreement just wasn't workable, something along those lines. And there's good reasons for him to say that, but the sort of various like pro-Russian propaganda like sites have said basically Zelensky admits that he had no intention of ever going through with the Minsk agreement. So that it's sort of presented as if, and this is what Russell Brand is sort of parroting here, Russian propaganda point, that Zelensky single-handedly abandoned the Minsk agreement, and that's just not true. So that's the Russian narrative. Zelensky single-handedly, unilaterally abandoned the Minsk agreement, and that's just not true. What we have is, okay, so then the history of the Minsk agreement had an initial version that was created. I was just trying to find. So back in 2014, the Minsk Protocol was initially signed to sort of freeze the fighting, but it didn't really freeze the fighting. It carried on. So that was signed in September 2014. But in October of 2014, the so-called Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, it wasn't a real Prime Minister, but just whatever. So Alexander Sakharchenko, he basically said that they were going to retake the strategically or symbolically important Donetsk airport in Ukraine. And they were just saying, well, the Minsk agreements don't cover this bit of territory. So they just start making random carve-outs and saying, well, we've got the Minsk protocol here to sort of have a ceasefire, but it doesn't apply to the bit of territory that we want to carry on fighting over. So they then took the Donetsk airport, and then things sort of died down a little bit. But then, the violence was still sort of continuing. Then come February 2015, they were like, okay, look, we need to make a new updated version of the Minsk agreement. So it got a bit more complicated and more provisions, etc., were put in. And then sort of a similar, by the way, Putin had tried to delay the ceasefire of the second version of the Minsk agreement by 10 days because they wanted to take this town, Debaltseve. So he was like, yeah, we can have a ceasefire, but let's delay it a bit so that we can sort of capture this town. And again, then the Russians were sort of claiming that the Minsk agreement, this sort of updated Minsk agreement, didn't really cover Debaltseve. And the point is that the Russians were kept sort of exploiting it and weren't really sticking to the terms of it very well. And overall, we need to understand what the Minsk agreements were. The Minsk agreements were an attempt to get a bit of a ceasefire, which neither side were sticking to completely, because the Ukrainians still have Russians on their soil shooting at them, and the Russians were still sort of pushing to get more territory. But more than that, what the Minsk agreement, especially the second version, really included was talking about giving Donetsk and Luhansk regions special status. And so from the Ukrainian perspective, Kiev perspective, they were prepared to give these regions some level of autonomy, a bit more sort of special status, just to sort of appease the Russians, get a ceasefire, and sort of stop some of the bloodshed. And the reason they wanted to do that was to try and give themselves a bit of a breather to build up their own military. The Russians, however, what they really wanted to do was interfere with Ukrainian democracy. So they had lost Yanukovych as their sort of puppet Russian president of Ukraine. And what the Russians wanted to achieve from the Minsk agreement, through the Minsk agreements, was to give the Donetsk and Luhansk regions a level of autonomy to the extent that Russians could have their puppets in control of these regions, interfering with and undermining Ukrainian democracy. The Minsk agreements themselves were essentially a form of they're a vehicle for Russian control of Ukrainian democracy. And that's the sort of context we need to understand what the Minsk agreements were, and why, from Zelensky's perspective, these agreements were never really fully workable.
Yeah. And I think the problem is, and again, we refer to a term I think that I used last time, which is Brandolini's law, bullshit asymmetry, which is, Russell Brand can very quickly say a bunch of things, and then if you are unquestioning, you just take that as, oh my goodness, yeah, and then you've taken on that baggage, and then you are biased against a position. But actually, we need to be skeptical about all of these little things that he says. They're not even half claims or full-on claims. But the problem is, as you can see now, we've just spent however long talking about this, and he spent just mere seconds making those claims. And so there's this bullshit asymmetry where it takes far longer to unpick and do things properly than it does to lay these misinformational claims out there. And I think that is well, it's really annoying and fairly disingenuous, I think, when people do that. We could also talk about the claims to do with the Panama Papers. Again, this is a massive topic, though. So Zelensky, prior to becoming president, while you were talking, I just found this article.
Yeah.
Prior to becoming president, he had offshore companies with his production, TV, comedian, TV shows that he's making and whatnot. That is absolutely not unusual. So basically, offshoring things is what am I justifying this? It's just basically every politician, every rich person kind of does this. Comedians do this. Interestingly, Russell Brand I don't think does, because I think he's dead against this. But tax. You can talk about the famous comedian Jimmy Carr in the UK, who got himself in trouble for doing this. So there's an interesting kind of parallel there. But anyway, he had offshore companies. And as it says here, the Pandora Papers showed that 2 offshore companies belonging to Zelensky's partners were used to buy 3 upmarket properties in central London. The papers showed that weeks before he won the presidential vote, Zelensky gave his stake in the British Virgin Islands registered Maltex Multi-Capital Corp to his business partner, Serhiy Shafir, who would later become a top presidential aide. So but again, this is not unusual and it's not illegal. But you can ask whether there is kind of A, nepotism going on there, and B, people making money off being in government. Well, this is actually before they were in government or even even involved in politics. So there is that. And it says, however, the document shows that the arrangement would soon be made to allow the company to continue paying dividends to a company that belongs to Ukrainian First Lady Zelenska, Olena Zelenska. The Pandora Papers did not indicate whether the dividends were ever paid or their size. Documents also don't say how many dividends were paid. Shafir produced Zelensky's TV hit shows, and his brother Boris wrote the scripts, also listed as the owner of Zelensky's network of offshore companies. Ivan Bakanov, a general director of Kvartal 95 and a longtime friend of the president, also has ownership in the companies. Bakanov was head of Ukraine's powerful SBU security agency between 2019 and 2022. The Zelensky advisor at the time claimed that the companies were formed to protect the group's income against the aggressive actions of the corrupt government of the then pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. And finally, journalists have a de facto confirmed that president's absolute respect for the standards of anti-corruption legislation, says Zelensky's advisor Mikhailo Podolyak to the AFP at the time. So there are things to do with offshore companies where Zelensky and his government or some of his aides and people he knows are involved in. But the question should always be: is that wrong? Is it illegal? And what are the problems associated with that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, put things in perspective. It's a guy who has some property in London, and essentially, I guess, is getting some income from this property through a company. This is not like arms dealing or anything, really dodgy. This is just he's getting some property income through a company. Now, I think, on taking office, he divested himself of the interest, but he's maybe passed it over to a friend, and maybe he's still going to. So maybe that's not exactly, in the spirit of what the law requires. Maybe he should have got rid of them more fully. I don't know, but I think in the scheme of things, it's not the worst sort of immoral, sort of shady business dealing in the world. And just to say also about Ukraine more generally, right? Well, Ukraine sat before on the eve of the Maidan protests under Russian President Yanukovych. Ukraine sat at 144th out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. 144th. Since then, free of Russian interference, it's been just rising up the ranks. In 2023, Ukraine climbed up, and again, another 12 places up to, at this point, 104th place. So that is a really big improvement from 144th to 104th. It now sits alongside Brazil, ahead of other EU candidate nations like Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Turkey. Ukraine's growth is one of the best results over the past year in the world. And this is despite being a war. Ukraine has done a fantastic job of stamping out corruption, and Russia, meanwhile, still sits down at 141st. So
so Ukraine is doing an awful lot better than Russia and is moving in the right direction. Russia is moving in the wrong direction. It is also, well, I don't want to do a bit of whataboutery here, but the same sort of people that criticize Zelensky and maybe, having offshore stuff or whatnot are often the same people who support, say, Donald Trump. And you're like, oh, have you seen the nepotism there? Have you seen the money that's been involved? You've got Jared Kushner at the moment out in Serbia, hoovering up properties there and being part of a $3 billion, mainly Saudi Arabian hedge fund management. Where's that money going? What's going, and Trump's own dealing. So, but that's not to say that you can't do business and then become a politician, right? Which is what, he's a comedian, but what is a comedian is a businessman where you're selling your product, and that included TV creation as well, TV products. And so, he was a businessman, became a politician, became the president, and then has these business interests that he is either divested or still has some stake in. Is that the question? Is that wrong? Is it illegal? And no, it's not illegal. Is it? Did he need to do cleverer things with that? I don't know. I don't know enough about the details to be able to say.
But especially if you point to Trump, I mean, Trump had much more extensive business dealings that he failed to get rid of on assuming office. I mean, he said he was going to get rid of all of these things when he became president, and then he didn't. And there's a lot that you can read online about how he's sort of really intertwined his own business dealings essentially in with the state, because he's so.
Well, he got people to stay at his hotels So
Yeah.
literally, he was making money off like international like meetings and whatever. Yeah, entourages would come to on official state visits, and they'd end up staying at his hotels and his golf courses and whatever. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. Your monuments clause in America needs some serious looking at with regard to his activities. I just think that that this is often overblown in a way of trying to show Zelensky to be something he's ostensibly not.
Yeah, because he's done a really fantastic job at like improving Ukraine, like especially in terms, along the corruption indices, like improving, moving them up the ranks, and
he's released his tax returns as well.
Yeah, there you go. And I would just say, like, we need to understand that the corruption issues that Ukraine has really are, I mean, I think it's fair to say, I think they really come from Russia. I mean, I sort of half joke that corruption is Russia's biggest export after oil and gas. I mean, it's a way that Russia uses to control people. So whether we can look at Yanukovych, but you can look at when they've installed puppets in like Georgia, and just in Russia itself, corruption is how Putin operates his regime. He took in all the mafia people in the 90s, put them in positions of power, uses them, like controls the oligarchs. It's all based on corruption. It's how he controls people. And Ukraine, yes, has had a history of corruption.
It's a Soviet legacy, yeah.
But it's a Soviet legacy.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue.
I feel a lot more comfortable
whose
about
coup in 2014?
The 2014 coup in Ukraine that was
Crimea.
backed by US interests.
Why would we back a coup that gave Crimea to Putin? They lost Crimea in 2014, Ukraine.
The ongoing, I think,
right.
That's quite interesting that actually Brand doesn't quite know what to do that. He had in his head, we've got this big coup of Zelensky, and he calls that a coup, which is a massive faux pas, in my opinion. Yeah. It's not a coup. And we talked about this last time because it's what Candace Owen said. They are singing from the same song sheet here, which is basically a pro-Russian narrative. Yeah. But it wasn't a coup. But then he was kind of caught off guard because what was the result of this coup? Well, they lost Crimea and the Donbass. So
yeah, exactly. He's just giving his sort of soundbite headline sort of Russian propaganda lines without really any understanding of it, and it shows. So that, I mean, to be fair, Bill Maher.
I don't think Bill Maher knows really what he's talking about.
Exactly. In his mind, he's conflating things, but the point is that Russell doesn't understand it well enough to sort of correct or explain it.
Yeah.
Bill, to say that this is a humanitarian war that has, as an inadvertent side effect, created all this opportunity for profiting for the military-industrial complex is as naive as suggesting that the pharmaceutical industry would keep good on their pledge to not profit from the pandemic. I'm not entering into the territory, like geopolitics is bloody complicated.
I think
Putin is
I just like the admission there. Geopolitics is bloody complicated. Yes,
he's on point there. I can tell you that. It's interesting though. The industrial military complex is an interesting sector, right? And I'm not traditionally a fan of it, right? I am anti like building up huge like industrial military complexes to like fuel wars around the world, but actually. I'm not a conspiracy theorist that thinks that they are driving wars, that somehow, they're going to be lobbying but for government and for contracts, but they're not going to be forcing people to go to war so that they make money. And in fact, there's some interesting analysis on this came out of I can't remember who it was. It might have been a Tochny piece or Andrew Perpetua piece, but as well in the Ukraine the Latest podcast, we're talking about actually they make generally more money in times of peace by doing these big contracts on say F-35s and they do on like the stuff you need like shells. Like the profit margin on shells isn't as great as on big F-35s, and those F-35 projects are like decades and decades long. and they are not. It's not about, right, we're going to go to war so we can sell F-35s. We're going to sell you F-35s on the back of like a whole load of R&D that we're concerned with, like whether it's peace or whether it's war. You know, this is what's going on brewing behind, and those projects are what cost us serious money. And so I think there's a bit of a myth to do with the industrial military complex driving wars.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and also, I mean, it's
easy pickings, I think, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the question is also, it's like there are lots of, why is it just that the CEOs of the military industrial complex have all these power? Because there are plenty of like CEOs, etc., of other industries that absolutely don't benefit from war. Like say you're the construction industry and various other things, have a lot of power. They don't want government money to be wasted on defense contracts. They would much rather have money being funneled into big infrastructure development projects for the country. And why is it that somehow the government thinks, oh, we've got all this money, we just want to pump it into the military industrial complex to appease these particular execs, even though it's a bit of a black hole sending a lot of this money just into the military, which blowing things up? Why isn't it somehow the CEOs of the construction industry or any other sort of industry who say, oh, actually, let's maybe funnel all of this money into these other projects, which actually would benefit the economy and all this other stuff? It doesn't make any sense to me.
For me, you're far more likely as a government to go to war if there are hydrocarbons involved.
Sure.
Like if you're going to be kind of conspiratorial about this, why did the US and the UK go to war in Iraq and fire stuff into Libya and you got Syria, those places? Why did we not go and unseat Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe? Because Zimbabwe doesn't have hydrocarbons. All those other places have hydrocarbons. So that's and I admit that will play a role in machinations and discussions and evaluations as to whether a country does something or not. And that will have played a part in the Ukraine debate as well. I'm sure that the West would have been interested in Ukraine because of, and Russia, both. But, Ukraine is a political football to some degree. But part of that is going to be that they've got natural resources aplenty in Ukraine, not just the hydrocarbons, but manganese and all sorts of interesting raw materials. Now that means that Ukraine becomes a political football between, say, the West and the East. But the question is always, but what do Ukrainians want? Okay, exactly. Yes, they're going to be a political football, but what about their own self-determination? And if they want to go towards the West and towards the EU, then they have the democratic self-determining right to do that.
Yeah, I think that's the most probably important point, I think, of this whole thing, which is Russell completely ignores or doesn't talk about what the Ukrainians want. His whole narrative is, it was a coup. I think at one point he says it was like a NATO-inspired coup. I'm not even sure what that means exactly, but it's some sort of Western forced coup, and this is all sort of driven by the West. And maybe what Russia's done isn't fantastic, he admits, but there's all the military-industrial complex, etc. And it's like, well, hang on, what do the Ukrainians want? He would talk about the peace deal, and he says how like Boris Johnson, etc., undermined the peace deal. Well, what do the Ukrainians want? It's not that Boris Johnson put a gun to Zelensky's head and said, "You're not allowed to have peace with Russia, despite what you want. You might want to have peace, but we're not going to let you have peace." The Ukrainians want to fight for their land. And coming back to the oil point, the Ukrainians, it's important to the Ukrainians that they retain specifically this eastern Donbass region and Crimea, because those are the areas where in 2013 they found oil and gas reserves. These areas are going to be vital to Ukrainian reconstruction and development and sort of coming modernization, etc., after the war. To just say, oh, well, let's just negotiate peace and let Russia keep these regions is going to be absolutely decimating to Ukraine's future.
So while you were saying that, it reminded me, I wrote an article on this kind of subject back in March 14th, 2022. And my article was in response to someone else I think broadly on the left, writing an article that was again blaming NATO for this. And I wanted to write a response, not because I disagreed with it, but I just wanted to understand it. And actually in writing the article, I evolved to the conclusion of what we we're just saying. So my article is the Russia-Ukraine conflict quite so clear-cut? Where I talk about the idea of NATO encroachment, and I talk about NATO versus Russia, and then Ukraine being a political football, but then conclude that while there is this stuff of NATO doing stuff and Victoria Nuland and all this, and McCain and all these people active over from the US and the EU and whatnot, if you just look at them, if you have that one track view of them, then your whole framework is, well, it's these people responsible for all of this. And as I said earlier, it's not, it's like these are in a response to the Russians doing. Now, if you want to talk about Russian interference in Ukrainian elections, we're going to have a very long conversation, because Russia have a rich history of doing that. And yet I don't hear Russell Brand or Candace Owens talking about how the Russians have been involved in puppet politicians and funding and disinformation. I don't hear them talk about little green men coming into the Donbass and starting an illegal war. Like, where are they talking about that? It's only focusing, it's just one track view on NATO people. And that kind of it just genuinely pisses me off, actually.
Yeah, I mean, just the one other point on like it's sort of similar with the Minsk thing is like he can talk about Zelensky abandoning the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreements were abandoned when Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, like, well, more fully. That's when the Minsk agreements were properly abandoned, in February 2022, and it's like it's again just very one-sided, just narrow blinkered view, which is all just fed from Russian propaganda.
And indeed, look, this is what I said back in 2022. And this is perhaps one of the most important things I have to say. When I mentioned earlier that Ukraine was a political football, we must recognize that this is to understand Ukraine as a tool to be used by others. We talk in this way. The media discusses in this way. Ukraine is referred to in terms of what it is to the east or to the west. Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation. So despite what we in the east or west might want it to be or do, it can and should be choosing for itself. And if it chooses via functioning democracy to join the EU or NATO or even Russia's sphere of influence, then it should be allowed to do so. And we should not sit by while a stronger nation punishes Ukraine with death and destruction for choosing in a way that it doesn't like. And I think, that pretty much says it all for me. But anyway.
Well, exactly. I mean, and I think the polls, there were those Gallup surveys, which I think in 2022 showed at least 2022 70% of Ukrainians wanted the war against Russia to continue. I think in 2023 it maybe gone down to 60 something, but it's still the majority of Ukrainians want this.
Yeah, exactly.
Clearly a former KGB hardcore dictator style politics, but like I think that when we extract the American unipolar agenda, the idea that there can be a global hegemony, that America want to destabilize Russia. Like, I think if you don't include that in the conversation, that what you get is a limited conversation.
We don't want to destabilize Russia. We were hoping after the Berlin Wall fell, and then 2 years later, Russia, the Soviet Union fell. We were hoping Russia would become one of the nations of the world that joined the family of Western democracies. There was no reason why they couldn't have democracy. They sort of gave it a go, but it was, obviously the past was so corrupted that the future was not going to be untainted either. And
can I just say, Bill Maher is on point there. Absolutely on point. So this is a really good point from Bill Maher that absolutely destroys Brand's position. So Brand here is talking about the unipolar hegemony hegemony means supreme power of the US in the world. So that's what BRICS has been developed to try and fight against, economically speaking and politically speaking: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is to provide some kind of trade alternative, maybe an alternative to the dollar being used as the international currency, so to have a multipolar world rather than a US unipolar world. But actually the US is involved globally, and there are people that don't see China as a necessarily just as an enemy, as a competitor, but someone you've got to work with. You know, there's so many Chinese goods in the US, free market trade. And actually, what Bill Maher is talking about is on point, because that's what Merkel and the EU were thinking and hoping, that when Putin took over, and there were signs that he was going to be this liberal leader, and at the beginning of his rule, it looked like he was going to be the sort of person that could take Russia into the fold of Western democratic capitalist, thinking, and by osmosis, Russia would evolve into something that was more aligned to the West. That didn't happen, but it could have happened. And I don't think we should blame Merkel and others for trying at the time to do that. Hindsight's always 20/20, and you look back and he just went down that power route. To the point where he's now just had a faux election, where as a dictator he's got his 5th term and is going to rule for longer than Stalin. But Brand fails to look at that alternative. It's like, well, you can choose the American hegemony, or you can choose a Russian kind of hegemony. Like, where would you want to be there? Like, I know which side I would choose if they were the two choices.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, brilliant. Well,
I just completely agree. I mean, it's just the idea that I think it's silly that they're saying, oh, well, we're trying to destabilize Russia. No one wants to just have a destabilized Russia. We wanted to work with Russia, but like Bill Maher points out, the legacy from the Soviet era, and also, Putin's stated aim to reform the USSR. As much as we open the door to Russia, ultimately, if he still thinks that the USSR should be,
it has no borders.
Yeah, exactly. If he thinks that, like, Ukraine has no inherent meaning and Ukrainian identity should be wiped off the planet, if all of these former Soviet territories are still essentially part of the Russian Empire to be reconquered, that's the problem. That's why it's not been like that's why it's not worked out. His sort of involvements in Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine, the cyber attacks against Western nations, that's why ultimately the relationship has fallen apart.
And Brand doesn't say anything about that, or at least so far. And also, we are trying to destabilize Russia now. Now we are, because they've invaded and they become a militaristic, imperialistic nation.
Yeah, exactly. But previously, there was obviously there was a lot of cooperation, and the French and Germans especially were really trying to foster those relationships.
And then we did make mistakes. I would agree with this, which you probably, I'm thinking in the direction you're going in. I don't think we should have kept rolling NATO. First of all, why NATO if there's no Soviet Union?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying we should have necessarily disbanded NATO, but instead of getting more, strong NATO, more countries, it should have been like, okay, we're saying that the Cold War is over, so why do we need an organization that's against you?
Yeah.
That was a terrible message to send. Yeah. And I think that set...
that's not why I thought he was going with that. So is he saying that he's blaming NATO a little bit for trying to gain in power at a time when it should have been receding because there was no threat from Russia?
Yes. Yeah. He's saying that the NATO should have, after the fall of the USSR, should have, receded.
Yeah, and by the way, just a point going back to previously when Bram was talking about we're trying to destabilize Russia. We were selling arms to Russia at that point.
Right,
literally, like in the early 2000s or whatever it was, we were selling arms to Russia. Like
things off. It may have gone to shit anyway. I mean, Russia is a tough place, and the people, have been brutalized by communism, which is horrible for the soul. Not to mention the pocketbook. But yeah, go ahead.
Bill, can I give you a bunch of facts? Because then you can riff on them, because I'd love to see your take on these facts that come from our content on our show. like our research gleaned from some great journalists, and it's mostly okay to say this kind of meta journalism.
Right.
We accumulate facts. We don't use anything that's not been endorsed in mainstream media. Let me hit you up with some of this stuff, and because I genuinely want to hear your take. But let me give you the whole thing as an overview, and then you can, as Bill Maher, because let's face it, no one else can do this.
Knock yourself out.
Okay, so former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said recently a Russia-Ukraine peace deal was blocked by Western powers. We know that Boris Johnson visited Ukraine and counseled Zelensky against taking the peace deal that's on the table. That's just one thing. Let me hit you with all this stuff.
But by the way, just a little distinction here. It's interesting when he says, right, here are a load of facts. And the first fact he gives you is a claim by someone. That isn't necessarily like the fact is that he said that is not the fact that that happened, and I can't speak to whether that happened or not. Like I don't have the requisite information, but this is like in philosophy you've got to be careful about when people say stuff. I'm always analyzing everything they say, and here right, he's going to give me a fact. What is the fact he's going to give me? Oh, that Natalie Bennett said this. Okay, well he said that. Is that true?
Well, exactly, and it's a really good point you make, because very interestingly, Naftali Bennett since said, he's retracted what he said. Essentially, people have taken his comments and sort of run with them and made this bigger deal out, really envisaged it as there was a peace deal on the table, and Boris Johnson came along and scuppered the whole thing. That's not correct. So Naftali Bennett has basically said, no, there was no peace deal. He's made it clear there was no peace deal. What there was like the basic framework. There was like an outline of, okay, well, we're going to try and work out a peace deal. We're going to talk about some different subjects, but they hadn't even got to the process of meeting and discussing and getting any of these terms agreed. And so Naftali Bennett has since said, look, there was no peace deal. There was just the basic outline framework for it. But there wasn't a peace deal, and so when Russell Brand comes along and says, I've got all these facts to tell you," that
makes what Russell Brand is doing here really disingenuous. I think it's fairly disingenuous from the beginning to now, but this just adds to it.
Zelensky has vowed to retake Crimea, but Russia said that's the red line that will spark nuclear war. We know that, all right?
Do we know? Do we know that? I mean, have they said that they would do nuclear war if they would take Crimea?
I think that I may have. There's not something I checked since watching this video, but I believe that's something that rings a bell. That he may have said that. Certainly, the sort of Russian sort of state TV people, they're threatening nuclear all the time. So
I know. And I know. But there's often, there's potentially a difference between what Putin says and what propagandists say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember exactly whether Putin said it or not, but I'll just say that even if he did,
that's saber rattling.
Yeah, and the point is that you can't just let someone like Putin just say, well, we're going to take this territory, and if you take it back, then it's a nuclear war. Or we're just going to take some more territory, but if you take it back, it's nuclear war. Because as much as no one wants nuclear war, and we all want to just sort of avoid it, obviously, what it does is it risks the chance of nuclear war further down the line. Because what message that they're sending out to the rest of the world, so North Korea, etc., is get nuclear weapons. Because if you've got some, you can swing them about and do whatever you want, and everyone's going to just back down. And Russia is using this. I really don't believe, and I understand why people will be nervous, but I genuinely don't believe that Russia is prepared to have Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the rest of Russia wiped off the face of the planet just because Ukraine has taken back Crimea.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look very quickly as to whether Putin has actually formally said that Crimea is a red line, a nuclear red line. I found a Newsweek article from last year saying that losing control of occupied Crimea is a, quote, red line for Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Estonian defense minister has said, though urged fellow NATO nations not to balk at Ukrainian operations towards the peninsula, regardless of fears over Moscow's nuclear arsenal. In other words, it's a feared red line,
Yeah.
and that we shouldn't be afraid of that. But it's not something that Putin's actually come out and formally said and attached a nuclear threat to that explicitly. I mean, there's lots of talk about it and lots of belief that it is so, but that's really different. And if that is the case, then again, Brand is being disingenuous.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I just think the idea
Republican Senate leader Mitt.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, and I was just repeating myself. I just think the idea that if Ukraine were to take Crimea, I mean, like if there was an actual nuclear war between the West and Russia, then Moscow, St. Petersburg, all of Russia.
Mitch McConnell said in December.
Sorry, I'm going mental. My computer's going nuts. Two different screens. Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just repeating myself. But I just don't see why Russia would want to risk having itself wiped off the planet just for Crimea.
Just looking at another Atlantic Council piece here, says Russia has responded in similar fashion to setbacks in the Battle of the Black Sea. Kremlin officials, so not necessarily Putin, have long sought to position Crimea as a red line for Russia, and this is a 2024 piece. But this has not prevented Ukraine from damaging or sinking approximately 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet. Humiliation has not provoked a nuclear response from Putin. Instead, the bulk of the fleet has retreated from its traditional home port in occupied Crimea to the safety of Russia. So even if it was officially said so by Putin, which I can't find any evidence of, it's clearly not a red line because Ukraine have they've done a few things to Crimea. They've forced the Black Sea Fleet out of Crimea, and yeah, I don't know. I don't agree with his point there. But anyway, we'll go on.
For 2022, the most basic reasons for Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell said in December 2022, the most basic reasons for continuing to help Ukraine degrade and defeat the Russian invaders are cold, hard, practical American interests. And then I'll just widen this out.
I agree.
Yeah, and but the point is they need that, right? We've had so much. What we have is, basically, obviously, Putin doing whatever he can in terms of the propaganda narrative to undermine either way. But they'll say on the one hand, oh, this is all just sort of for American interest. But then on the other hand, he'll say, and Tucker Carlson, etc., will say, well, what's in it for us? We've got problems at home. Why are we worrying about what's going in Ukraine? We shouldn't be spending all this money. We're just suffering from it and wasting all our taxpayer money on Ukraine. There's no benefit for us. So why are we doing it? And then on the other hand, they'll say, oh, well, it's all just for American benefit. It's just contradictory and nonsense.
Yeah, and I've talked about this for a long time, which is, the moral argument is out there. But if you want to sell it to the American population who has not been convinced by the moral argument, then you use the American strategic argument. In America and in Europe, you use it in terms of Europe, right? But it's the same argument, and it's in the best interest strategically, geopolitical for the US, in terms of economic trade, in terms of the industrial military complex as well. All of these components add into that it's in America's best interest to help Ukraine, which aligns to the moral argument as well. It's not either or, it's both and.
Yeah.
Out a little. The Pentagon spent $14 trillion after 9/11. 55% of it went to for-profit defense contractors. The average American taxpayer contributed $2,000 to the military last year. More than 900 of that went to corporate military contractors. At least 50.
But when you look at it there, again, you're forgetting that 9/11 happened in the first place. Yeah. So it's almost to just look at one area and say, what's he trying to say? That the American military-industrial complex organized 9/11, because that's essentially what he said. That's what he said for Ukraine, because he said this is all a NATO-inspired industrial military complex thing going on in Ukraine. Yeah. And then he goes, look at how much money was spent after 9/11. What do you think Lockheed Martin paid for 9/11 to happen?
He may well do.
Politicians who shape US defense policy have investments in military contractors.
That is a problem. Lobbying is a problem in the US, and I agree. I don't have an issue with his point there.
Agreed. Yeah.
Contractors split their checks more or less evenly between Democrat and Republican candidates last year, and Biden appointed a former BlackRock MD to the cabinet, in particular to sort out the post-Ukrainian reconstruction.
Okay, stop.
These are good facts, Bill.
These are facts. Possibly. I don't have a fact checker here. I don't doubt it.
You're not going to need one.
Wait. but it's so far from the point. I mean, I feel
No.
like your antenna for conspiracy theories. I mean, you have a good antenna, and then sometimes it does not serve you well because, like, even if all this stuff is true,
Yeah.
it's just more complicated than that. Both things can be true. It can be something that is a worthy endeavor to stop Russia from invading another country, and it also could be the case. It is the case, of course. People in the defense industry are looking to keep having reasons to make weapons and so forth.
Yes.
There are people who absolutely have a vested interest in war. Those are what your facts are saying. It doesn't mean, even if all that is true, and I would agree, there are people who have a vested interest in war. That doesn't mean, logically, it doesn't mean that every war is because of that.
I would,
which is what we've already said that. So Bill Maher is, in my opinion, on point.
Yeah, he is. I mean, I think so the rest of the video is really just him sort of talking a bit more, making this point on and on about sort of really the military industrial complex. And he at one point he just says, you know, if it's a possible reason that, you know, these sort of with these defense contractors sort of can make profits from it, that being somehow the reason, if it's possibly the reason for the war, isn't that the most likely reason?
So I love what you just said. Do you know why I love what you just said? It's because I've written about this a gazillion times, right? So this is a fallacy that's been given a Latin name by Richard Carrier called the possibiliter ergo probabiliter fallacy, which is, and you see this all the time in philosophy of religion, particularly. So I argue with a lot of people who say, well, this could be the case. Therefore, and they do this jump, well, it's conceptually possible to it, therefore it's going from possible to probable to therefore it's what happened. And then they live in the, well, this is what happened area. It's like, well, where's your basis for this? This is what happened. Oh, it's because it's what conceptually could have happened. Oh, there's some invalid jumps there going from conceptual to definite, and it's a real problem that needs to be undone with some decent critical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, and that literally is the rest of his argument for the rest of the video. Is just he's just saying, well, there are, you know, Iraq, blah blah, Lockheed Martin, BAE. It must, you know, it could be they want to make money, so that must be the reason. He sort of tries to make the argument that these countries these companies shouldn't be making any profit from it. I don't really know if that's sort of feasible to say, you know, these companies are just going to produce all of this military equipment without making any sort of profit. You know, they are ultimately private enterprises, and they're going to not want to just waste their time making things for free. We don't have a sort of centralized government-run defense industry. They are, well, at least in America, I think there's a lot outsourced. But yeah, that's the situation. But that doesn't mean, yeah, as you say, that's suddenly all of a sudden the reason for the war. It doesn't negate what's actually happened with the Russians invading and the Ukrainians wanting to fight back against it.
It's trying to reverse the causality there for ideological ends. So here's someone that is clearly anti-American imperialism, and I think that's Brand's agenda there. And in looking at American imperialism, he's forgetting Russian imperialism and Soviet imperialism before that, and only one track focused on one side of the coin here, and even then falsely attributing causality. So I have a big problem with what Russell Brand has said in almost everything he's just said. Yeah,
agreed. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much sort of the end of it. I think maybe just one thing I wanted to just come back to was just the sort of the peace deal point. And because, you know, we mentioned about the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali, and he sort of clarified that there wasn't really a peace deal there. But also, we need to just understand that even if there was something more of a peace deal, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians wanted to have a peace deal. In terms of the population, as I say, the people did. But if we also look at what the Russians were pushing for, you know, the Russians ultimately are looking to take Crimea and 2 significant regions of Ukraine. That's not something that Ukraine, for any reason, wants to just give away. You know, it doesn't gain anything from just saying, okay, well, you can have Crimea. Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This is just, they've got a gun to their heads and are being, threatened with further invasion. So, this idea that, it's all just, there was this peace deal and everyone would have lived happily ever after. I mean, that's a fiction. I mean, we've also heard that the Russians were basically looking to limit, obviously they don't want they wanted assurances that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, which obviously I think is ridiculous because that's the only real protection it could have against further invasion. But Russia was also looking to have Ukraine cap its armed forces at 85,000 troops, 342 tanks, and 519 artillery. So a 60 to 70% reduction in its pre-war arms forces. So, they basically wanted Ukraine to sort of decimate its own military and also say that they weren't going to sign a security agreement with NATO. And then Russell Brand and other people want to sort of have this narrative that, oh, well, there was this peace deal and everyone was gonna live peacefully, happily ever after. Well, no, they weren't.
As this Business Insider article says, former Israeli Prime Minister rebuts the claim, which is boosted by Russia and by Russell Brand, that the US blocked a Ukraine peace agreement. Quote, it's unsure that there was any deal to be made. It may have been, as I say, as you've said, in the early stages of discussion, and the US said, no, this is not going to be good for Ukraine. And if you call that then stopping a peace deal, then yeah, maybe. But I would have said the same thing.
But I don't think it's the case that the US made any sort or Boris or anyone made any sort of decision on that. I think what you have is the outline framework of, well, maybe we're going to have some discussions. Okay, we've also got to bear in mind that on the 1st of April, 2022, because the deal or whatever was sort of the idea of making a deal, I should say, was sort of rejected later in April. On the 1st of April 2022 was when the evidence of the Booker massacre started to come out.
So this is what the part of the article here says, but Bennett has clarified that no such deal existed and said talks broke down because of apparent Russian war crimes.
Exactly. And so Russians have then tried to turn around and say, oh, well, this was Boris who came along and sort of messed up the deal. We told them, well, we didn't tell them that they couldn't have a peace deal. I mean, we can't tell them that they're not allowed to have a peace deal. They want to have
That's
a peace
a
deal.
really good point. That's really actually making Russia look weak. As if Boris could come along and say to Russia, you can't do a peace deal. And Russia went, oh, okay, then. See you later. Well, we can't do a peace deal because Boris said so.
Yeah, well, it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom, for helping us to see how Russell Brand's claims there appear to be completely or largely erroneous, and I think fairly disingenuous for him to make the claims in a way that he has done there. Really appreciate that. Yeah. I'd look forward to doing this again with yet another video where we can pick apart what people say.
Yeah, thanks very much. I enjoy it. It's this, as you say, it takes so much time, trying to pick it all apart, and there's so much history, and I want to try and get across the facts here, but getting, as you say, just even as one off the cuff comment by Russell can take 20 minutes, just really sort of really explaining it through all in detail. So there is a lot to get through, but this is the problem. There's just so much of this nonsense out there, and it's from prominent voices like Russell Brand. It's a bit worrying.
Yeah, definitely. Well said. Well, look, mate, appreciate that. Take care of yourself, and we'll keep working on what we can talk about next. In the meantime, to the team, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all of your support in all the different ways. And toodle pips.
Cheers.